Hey, in this video, we're going to talk about watercolor supplies that make a difference. So I started painting with watercolor about 8-ish years ago, and I started with painting supplies that I just had around the house. I didn't really invest in any good quality supplies, but about a year into practicing with watercolor, I got my hands on some really good high quality materials like the brushes, the paints, the paper that I'm going to show you in this video, and it transformed everything about my paintings, my process, and my practice and love for painting. So if you are confused about what supplies to be using for watercolor, or maybe you're feeling stuck with the supplies that you already have and have been using for a while, then this video is for you. Okay, let's talk about supplies. The supplies that I use are all high quality but budget friendly at the same time for the most part. And so I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the supplies I use, why I use them. So let's talk about my palette. This is a Traveler's plastic watercolor palette. I use this for filming. I use this for traveling. I've had this palette for probably about 6 or 7 years. Whoopsie, we've got a little, I don't know where that came from. I've had this palette for about 6 or 7 years. I love it. I also have a ceramic palette by Sylvan Clay Works that I absolutely love, but that thing stays on my desk because it's pretty heavy. And I use about, I think, 14 of these colors now because I added a couple more this past year. So if you're looking at my palette and you're like, wait, that looks like way more colors than just 14 colors, that's because I have this pink in here I used for about a week 7 years ago, and I haven't used it since. And then same thing with these two greens. I rarely ever use. This is Winsor green, this is olive green, and I don't use these. This one, I thought it said, the tube said watercolor, but it was actually gouache, and so it's hard as a rock in here. And I don't use it. I could obviously scoop it out, scrape it out, but I have been lazy. Before I move on to the pigments that I use, the colors and their names, one thing that I do get asked about this palette is what this thing is for. And that is, if you're standing and painting, you can hold your palette with your thumb inside here. And then you have little brush holders right here. But I never stand and paint. If you do stand and paint though, that's pretty fun. And then it folds up and can travel with you. It's perfect for little art retreats or something like that if you're traveling and painting. All right, so let's talk about the colors that I actually do use in my palette, starting at the top with Mars Black. I stick with all of my cool colors on the left side and then all of my warm colors on the right side. So if you're new to this channel, I talk about separating warm and cool colors quite often. We'll get more into it in the color theory video of why I separate my cool versus warm colors and which ones make up cool and warm. But simply, if I am mixing, let's say orange and blue, for example, in the same mixing dish or mixing well area, it's just gonna make muddy brown colors. So contrasting colors are gonna make brown. And so I have all of my cool colors on the left side, all of my warm colors on the right side. So black, this is a cool black, it's Mars Black by Winsor & Newton. All of my colors are by Winsor & Newton, and they are professional level. So if you are going to all the links we have in this video and you're looking up the paints and you want to buy or want to purchase the paints that I use, you might be startled by some of the price tags. However, I always use, if you're buying a 14 milliliter tube of paint, of watercolor paint, you're using about a quarter or a third of that tube to squirt, the technical term squirt, a dish worth of paint in here. And I let my pigment dry overnight, so for about 24 hours, and then I use it. I just wet the area, wet the pigment that I want, soak up the pigment that I want, etc., and then go to my paper. There's a couple reasons for this. So instead of using paint straight from the tube, like a lot of people do, which is totally fine, I like to let it dry first because it's just like watercolor pans or cakes of pigment. You can still get some really rich opaque pigment if you work your brush in there a lot. But the number one reason why I do it this way is to not waste pigment. If you are going straight from the tube, with wet pigment, a lot of people will waste the pigment. And then along with that, it lasts a really long time. So like I haven't refilled, I paint every single day, and I haven't refilled my pigments in about 3 or 4 months. I'm getting low on some of my yellows. These are the same yellows, by the way. I'll talk about it in a second. So I'm getting low, and I'll just squirt a little bit more of the wet pigment on top of it. So a 14 milliliter tube might cost you $15, $16, but it's gonna last you 8 to 12 months most likely if you're painting every single day. Obviously, certain colors will run out quicker. I run out quicker of the yellow a lot quicker than, let's say, cobalt blue, because I rarely use cobalt blue. It's only for special occasions. So, look at that when you're looking at the price tag up front, and then maybe just start with a few colors, or start with just primary colors in black or something to get you started and see the difference between high quality paint and student level or something that is not as quality. So Mars Black, Winsor Newton Professional Level, this is Burnt Umber. Then we have Ultramarine Violet. Then I have Prussian Blue. I've got Cobalt Blue, Phthalo Turquoise. Again, this was this weird turquoise gouache that I thought was watercolor. This is Winsor Green Blue shade that I haven't used in a few years. I just add blue to my sap green, which is the green that I use all the time. I use this every single day if I'm painting florals. This is my favorite green. And then Olive Green. I don't really use it that much because I'll usually, if I want like an olivey green color, I'll just add Burnt Umber to sap green. So these two colors you really don't need unless you don't want to keep mixing up the blue greens and the brownish sagey greens, then maybe you can buy them if you want. Otherwise, I just mix up secondary colors with sap green. And then I have 2 dishes of Lemon Yellow Deep on my cool color side because I like to mix up greens with sap green. And then I also like to mix up greens with my turquoisey colors. And so if I used the same yellow, obviously you can see by my palette, I'm very, very type B. And so I am going directly on top of dishes of color with other colors on my brush. If that stresses you out, then you can just go into your mixing wells. But the reason why I do this is because it's quicker, it's faster, it allows me to work wet and wet a lot quicker. And I can always just add water to this and dab it up, clean it up with a paper towel if I need to. Then over here I have Cobalt Turquoise and Manganese Blue. This Manganese Blue and Cobalt Turquoise I recently added. I'm not a huge fan of the Cobalt Turquoise because I was looking for something that was like macaw feather blue turquoise, the actual element turquoise. So Manganese Blue is like a new addition to my palette as of a few months ago, and I'm loving it. Great color. And then over here on the warm side, we have Scarlet Lake. This is like an orangey tinted red. So I'm not using cadmium red or, colors that are your traditional reds or traditional blues. I like to have that kind of like off, not hipster colors, trendy colors, corally red, it's cute. And then Opera Rose. This is a bright neon pink color when you get it by itself and a lot of pigment on your brush. It's beautiful. I don't remember which orange this was, but again, this is one of the colors that's been in my palette for about 7 years and I never use it. I think it's Winsor Orange. I don't even know if that's a color anymore. I haven't said that in like years, so I don't remember. Cadmium Orange I rarely use just because it has cadmium in it. But it is a great orange. If you want to mix up oranges, I usually do some Scarlet Lake in yellow or Opera Rose in yellow for a bit more of a blushy orange. But cadmium orange is a great orange. It has a toxic ingredient in it, unfortunately. Again, never use this color. Don't remember what it is. I think it's also gouache because it's super duper hard. But never use it. And then this is Lemon Yellow Deep, and Yellow Ochre. So I use, like I do Lemon Yellow Deep over here, 2 different oranges or what I'm mixing up. These are like for my muted oranges with yellow ochre or, not as vibrant. And then over here, I'm mixing Scarlet Lake or Opera Rose with it. So all of these colors are by Winsor Newton. They're all professional level. Again, everybody is going to be different. Every artist is different. Some artists have really great success with student level paints. However, I use professional level paints just because I love the rich pigments. They are pure pigments. There's less binding agent in the tube of paint. So student level paints are less expensive because they're using a lot more binding agents to basically lessen the intensity of the pigment, but also bind it to the other mixture in the other ingredients in the mixture of the tube to make it cheaper. So they're not like using pure pigment. And there's, more binding agent in there. So it's not as rich. It doesn't blend as well, I've noticed. Obviously, there's a lot of people out there, though, that use student level, have great success. So start where you can with the budget that you have. I love professional level, though, just because of all of the capabilities I have with it. The rich pigment, like I said. So there is my palette. Now let's talk about brushes. So for brushes, for my brushes, I really only use these 3 brushes, except for if I'm painting like a stripes pattern or something that, is a big wash. I will use a wash brush by the same brand, or a flat brush by the same brand. But my absolute favorite 3 brushes are these 3 round tip brushes by Princeton. These Princeton brushes are from the series Heritage 4050, and I use the size 2, size 6, and size 16 round brushes most frequently. The size 6 being my all-time favorite brush. If I was stranded on a desert island, what would be one art supply, like out of everything that I would take with me, it would be this brush, which I guess I couldn't use it if I didn't have paper, so that's unfortunate, but this would be the brush that I would take. I love this brush. It's very versatile. All of these brushes are synthetic sable hair brushes, so no harming of animals. Very, very high quality brushes. Princeton, I've been to a couple of in-person, like I went to a trade show with them back in 2018 in Las Vegas, and I got to meet the founder, Howard, who is like literally the sweetest man of all time. We got along so well. I love him so much. The whole team at Princeton's amazing. But I got to hear him talk about the making of these brushes and how they've been handed down this Japanese style of making these brushes with the ferrule and the hair and the binding from a 3rd generation brush maker in Japan, and all of this fascinating stuff, and why they use these, or why they created the technology for these brushes, and no harming of any weasels, and the actual natural hair brushes, which no shame on anybody who does that, but I just prefer not to. And they're at like a quarter of the price of a natural brush with, I believe, better technology than natural brushes. Now, I know I'm going to get hate in the comments from the natural brush fanatics, the actual sable brush fanatics, because people are very, very pearl clutchy when it comes to their brushes, their natural hair brushes. And I totally get it. But these synthetic sable hair brushes from Princeton are incredibly flexible. They snap right back to form when they're really wet, and you maybe push on it with a vertical hold like this and the brush fans out. They snap right back to their fine point tip. So they're really flexible, really snappy. They also hold a lot of pigment and water, which is a huge advantage when you're painting with watercolor. Obviously, acrylic, oil, all of the different mediums are going to have different technology and advantages with the type of hair that they use, the ferrule, all of that kind of stuff. So you definitely want to check out the different series of brushes that Princeton has if you're painting with acrylic and not watercolor, obviously, because it's going to be different. But all of these brushes are really snappy, flexible. And that was a huge, eye-opening thing for me when I first started painting with watercolor. I didn't have these brushes. And about a year into painting with watercolor, I discovered Princeton, and I was like, oh, this is what painting with good brushes feels like. So make sure you check out those brushes, all linked below. I use, again, size 2, 6, and 16. The size 16 is for my big flowers, big peony petals, big leaves, or if I want to cover a large wash area and I don't have a wash brush with me, then I'll use this size 16. And then size 6 is pretty much what I use 80% of the time when I'm painting florals. And then for small details, I'll use a size 2. I love using this size 2 brush too if I'm painting something like architectural drawings or style paintings with fine details, or portraits where I'm getting really, really fine details as well. So these are great versatile brushes. You really don't need much more than this. Obviously, I have jars and jars of brushes that I've just accumulated over the years. I think that's just like an artist thing to do. We love collecting brushes and we think we're going to use them all the time. I use them very infrequently, unfortunately, and have been gifted to many, many friends over the years and many kids who are starting to pick up watercolor. So that's a good use for them. But these 3 I always come back to. Love them tons. All right, next let's talk about paper. For paper, I use Legion Paper Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press. So the biggest question people have when it comes to what paper should I use for watercolor is, should I use cold press or should I use hot press? And there are many talented professional artists who use hot press. There's many talented professional watercolorists who use cold press, like myself. And the main reason why I use cold press is because of the texture. So hot press paper, the actual process of making the paper is going to use a hot press that basically smooths out all of the pulp, all of the texture in the cotton paper. So this is 100% cotton paper, and it smooths it out in the process of making the paper. Cold press doesn't use that process, obviously. It's a cold press, so it's gonna have this nice toothy texture to it. It's got, if you zoom in really closely, which you don't zoom in with your eyeballs, that's just with cameras, I guess. But if you look really closely at your paper and you have cold press paper, you should see some bumps in texture. That toothy texture is what helps hold the water and the pigment in place while it's drying. So I tried using hot press paper, and maybe it's my style, maybe it's just the way that I paint, but I do use a lot of water when I'm painting. And so with hot press paper, I kept noticing that I would have to come back to areas or petals when I was over painting something else to like mess with it and make sure that no hard lines were, happening on the paper, because a lot of movement happens on really smooth paper. A lot of hard lines happen on really smooth paper because it's not being absorbed by that toothy texture. So I prefer cold press paper just because of that. But you want to make sure when you're using paper, you want to make sure that you are using 100% cotton paper, that it's acid free. And then I use 140 pound or 300 GSM paper. I don't really go any much above that, so I don't use 300 pound paper, mainly because I found that it absorbs perfectly with 140 pound paper. And then this is a block of paper instead of a pad. So pads are glued just at the top or just on one side of the paper. So let's say you have 15 sheets, they're just glued at the top edge or one of the edges. A block of paper, you usually are glued on all four sides, and there's either a corner that's left unglued, or for the Legion paper, it's on the side right here, like about 1.5 inches is unglued. So that is where you would slide your finger or a soft ruler or a canvas bone to lift off the top sheet. And the reason why I paint with a block of paper is because it keeps all edges of my paper completely flat while I'm painting. Because we're painting with watercolor, we're adding water to paper, and that's going to create buckles, that's going to create warps and divots and dips and valleys in our paper. And so if you're painting with just a loose sheet on your table and you're noticing that it's like creating this V with your water and pigment pooling into that V because it's creating a valley because you're adding water to your paper, then you're going to get some funky drying moments. You're going to get some hard lines and some wonky things that you don't want. So I use a block for that reason. If I do use just a single sheet of paper, then I will pull out my 3M artist tape, that blue painter's tape, and tape all four sides down on a piece of cardboard instead of taping it on my table, because I like to rotate my paper when I'm painting. So if you do work with loose sheets or you have a pad of paper and you don't want that to happen, then just take off that top sheet from your pad or your loose sheet and tape it to something that you can rotate. You can even use, if you just have like a used block or a used pad, you can tape it to this, but that way you can still rotate your paper. So that is paper. Another great brand of paper is Arches. So many different ways you can say it. I'm not fancy, so we're saying Arches. But Arches is great paper. It's just slightly more expensive than this Legion paper. And I find that this, and Fabriano is an excellent paper as well, still more expensive than Legion. So Legion was my go-to after working on Arches, working on Fabriano for a few years, because I found that it was a great, it was very similar to Fabriano, texture-wise, and also the off-whiteness. It's not too bright white. So I went with this paper because it's cheaper, and because I'm recommending supplies all the time, I didn't want to recommend, $40 pad of paper like Arches is. So there you go. And then one more thing that I always have on hand is paper towels or a washcloth or something I can wash or dry my brushes off and get rid of pigment onto. And then I use 2 cups of water. 1 cup is for, you can rinse off cool colors, and the other cup is for rinsing off warm colors, or you can use it for your dirty cup of water where you're rinsing off your brush if you have pigment still left on it. and then clean cup of water to pick up clean water before you go to your pigment or your paper. So, So we have a supply playlist all dedicated to my love of supplies, many videos in there. So if you want to learn more about supplies that I use and why I use them, check out that playlist. We'll link it in this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. That was just one part of our complete beginner's guide to watercolor. So make sure you go check out that master video. It's got all the goods in it. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.